Good morning, Erica. How are you this morning?
I'm good. It's Saturday. I got to sleep in this morning. It's a good morning.
Isn't that awesome? I'm looking forward to the days when my kids are not so little and I do get to sleep in again. Because right now it's 6 o'clock no matter.
Yeah. Yeah, you're in a world of not sleeping in right now for sure.
Yeah, but that's okay. It'll happen one day.
Yeah.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. If you are joining us, jump on here, say hey, let us know that you're there. We want to hear from you. We are 2/3 of Readiness Group. So I am Dr. Kelly Guidry, and I am a licensed professional counselor. And Readiness Group is a wellness and training development company. And so I'm going to let Erica introduce herself so you guys know who she is also.
Yep, I'm Dr. Erica Salee. I'm a doctor of physical therapy, working mostly neurological PT, developmental PT, and also working quite a bit with trauma and stress.
Yeah, and so today we are talking about a topic that we talk a lot about, which is the science of trauma. We tend to be a little bit nerdy about this stuff. We really like it. And so we're going to try to talk about it and make it make sense and why we're talking about it. So I kind of want to start there, Erica, and because we work a lot with what we call high stress professions. And so people who kind of see trauma and deal with stress and trauma on a daily basis. But I think this conversation is important for anyone. And so I kind of want to talk about maybe why that is. Do you want to start with that?
Yes, I think this is an important topic. When we work, it's a lot of first responder military, like you said, also accident investigators. We work a lot with school districts too, which I consider a high stress profession, just having worked in the school districts before. And then also medical individuals, so which, as we all know right now, is a very high stress profession. And it's important for those individuals, if we're going to tell them, some strategies for how to decrease stress in their lives, to process through trauma, whether that be a professional resource such as counseling, EMDR, different things like that, or a personal resource such as peer support and talking through, hey, Sam, and talking through some of the stuff that they've been through. They've got to have a certain buy-in factor to why that's effective. Because when you tell a room full of firefighters that they need to talk about stuff, to them what they're reading is kumbaya. I just want to, you just want us to show how much we care and talk about our feelings and all that sort of stuff. And it's not that, right? There's a physiological reason why we're saying that something like peer support or having a conversation about a difficult time is a really important thing to do. We are all in a very stressful world right now. So our stress level, we're seeing a lot of us in hypervigilance, even if we're not in a high stress profession, just because of the stuff that we are facing, right? And so in our lives, so we're, high stress is a chronic issue, a chronic health issue for a lot of people. And it's one of the leading factors to a large majority of the health issues that our nation is facing right now. And so it's important that everybody understands the physiology behind it and how they can counter that with some good tactics that decrease that high stress perspective in our lives. And so I think that it's not just for first responders and military and all those high stress professions, although they do have a great chance of facing a lot more trauma based on their profession and the responsibilities of their jobs. However, I will tell you that a lot of first responders and people in high stress professions have an extremely high coping capacity and have resources built to deal with that trauma that they face. And so there are those of us who don't face that kind of stuff on a regular basis, that don't have those strategies built because we don't face that stuff regularly. So I think it's really important that everyone have this knowledge, not just those high stress professions.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that something that is interesting to maybe point out is that usually what's happening when people are experiencing either chronic or critical stress is, it's that stress response in the brain, and that's being activated. And I think that I even talk about it with parents when I'm working with parents and kids. And when kids get overwhelmed and their brain gets overwhelmed, it's that same response that's happening. And so understanding what stress does and how then you can recognize that in yourself, in your family members, in your coworkers, whatever that looks like, kind of gives you insight into maybe how you can better deal with it again with yourself in your relationships and kind of all the way around. I was just talking to my daughter. My daughter's 6, and I was just talking to her this morning about her little stress response because we had a rough night last night before we had come over, and she was just like, it was amazing. Yeah. And the crazy part is she brought it on herself, and so we kind of went back and we were talking about it, and we're going to talk in a little bit about a way maybe to talk about it with kids, but also with yourself, so that you kind of understand this is what's happening when I start to get worked up, and it's likely due to your plate being full. You have too much going on, and that's that chronic stress that we kind of talk about. So let's do that really quick. Maybe talk a little bit about the difference between chronic and critical stress, because I think that's an important piece of this conversation also.
Perfect. I'll talk about it from a high stress profession and a not so, and maybe a family perspective, right? So when we talk about chronic versus critical stress, in the past, the way we have responded to different things is we wait till it gets critical, right? And then we reactively try to work through whatever a really tough situation is. And so what we're trying to do now in the resiliency world is identify chronic versus critical stress. So critical stress for a high stress profession, let's say a first responder profession, it's pretty big, right? They face trauma on a regular basis, so it takes quite a bit for it to become critical for them. And so, they'll tell you pretty much anything that's pediatric that they respond to is usually a critical situation. Anything that happens to one of their own is usually a critical situation. Mass casualty, the accident out here on I-35 when it was icy with I can't remember how many hundreds of cars that were involved in that. That would be a critical situation. And so it takes quite a bit for it to become critical for them. However, and we talk about this quite often in our class, what's critical for one person is not critical for another, and vice versa, right? Like everybody comes at life with different experiences. And so the way we interpret the experience we have can make something that may not be critical to one person be very critical to another. And so it's very much based on what you've been through in your past, what you're going through right now, what's on your plate with your chronic stress that makes you interpret what you're going through as potentially very critical. From a family perspective, this can be bullying at school. I mean, for a 13-year-old kid to go into an environment, and you could probably speak to this more, Kel, I'll let you do that, but that can be a very critical thing for a young kid. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think, I look at the kids I work with and just what they face today with all of they have lots of input, right? Like they have access to everything, and we just didn't have that, or at least I know I didn't growing up. And I think that's a huge piece of it. And so those critical incidents for them, sometimes in counseling, I refer to them as the cows. They're the crisis of the week.
Yeah.
But when you see that, adolescents especially are super reactive. And so when something like that happens as adults, sometimes we think it's small or little, but it's really not, because in their world, it's a pretty big deal what's happening. And if it is something like bullying, it can get really, really big really quick. So that's important to kind of know and just be on the lookout. So when we talk about like signs and symptoms and kind of what to look for, it might look a little different in kids, especially because they don't always know how to express those emotions. Sometimes we as adults don't either. So let's just be honest with that one, right?
And I think it's so important because it's, at this point in their lives, we're teaching them and helping them build the skills for working through those critical things. So to them, that's critical. And if we as parents go, you'll get past that, that's not a big deal. What you're not doing is teaching them the strategies for how to handle some of the bigger stuff as they get older, right? And so we have to help them walk through those things that we may think is small, but to them it's the world and it's a big deal. And if we can work with them to teach them how to handle that and how to calm themselves down and respond versus react and that kind of thing, then they carry that into their adulthood when they will be facing things that we may at that point consider big, right? So.
Exactly. And a lot of times, and this is true, I think, for anybody, so all ages in this, is that we sometimes go through an event or something in our lives, and we don't always think it's a big deal at the time. So it's not always an immediate thing either. And I think that's, you don't know when something's going to come back. And that's why we say all the time, talk about it. Even if you don't think it's a big deal, have a conversation with somebody. Have a way that you are processing your day, whether that's through journaling or talking to a buddy or your spouse, or, have those conversations at the dinner table with your family, allowing people to just volunteer and talk about their day, kind of gives them a space to process some of what's gone on, which can reduce it from the potential of becoming something bigger later.
Yes.
But oftentimes when an event does happen, we don't always think it's going to be a big deal. And then, 2-3 weeks, 2-3 months, 2-3 years down the road, all of a sudden, maybe something triggers it and it's bringing us back.
Yeah. And I think that, Brenda brought this up yesterday in one of the classes we were teaching to Dallas Fire, and it, we haven't really talked about what is chronic yet. Chronic is life, right? Like, it's all the personal things that we have, personal and professional, that just stack on our plate and impact our ability to deal when things get more critical, right? Like, if you have a full plate going into a really big incident, like a death of a family member or a car accident or whatever it might be, your ability to work through that and grow from it on the other side is hammered because you've already got too much on your plate, right? And so when we talk about chronic stress, we talk about getting left of boom or upstream of an incident. It's all about clearing your plate as much as possible so that when you do face challenge in life, which we're all going to face, you've got the capacity to work through it and grow versus living in it for the rest of your life, or PTSD, or whatever the case might be. But Brenda brought up in class, can chronic become critical, and can critical become chronic? And I think that's important to realize. If you don't work through this stuff, then what's chronic? Finances, marital issues, that becomes critical. Foreclosure on a house, divorce, all of those kinds of things. What's critical, something that you go through that you push aside and don't deal with it, then it becomes a chronic stress it could become a chronic stress for a large majority of your life because you're constantly running from it, right? Running from those memories and running from those anxious feelings and anger and that kind of thing. And so it's important to recognize that not handling those two things can make them stack up on the other side as well.
Yeah, what a great point. What a great conversation. I would have.
Yeah, it was good. Those Dallas firefighters, man, they're on point. It was awesome. They had such good stuff to add, They've got such an incredible perspective. Any firefighter, any first responder, the stuff that they face, it's crucial that they handle that stuff, for them to be able to live their lives. And Sam, very good point. Sam actually has taught with us this week. He was there for one of our days, and we'll be there for several more as we're working with Dallas Fire. But yeah, it's crucial for these people to, they call them, refer to them as tactical athletes, right? Like they have to be on their game every day of the year when they're working, because they've got to be able to focus and do their job. And then also, oh, by the way, go home and be present for their families and enjoy their lives, right? And so for them to be able to do their job and still enjoy their lives, it's crucial that they have a strategy for working through this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about a little bit about the brain, and I want to make sure that we try to stay as not sciencey as
You're good with the hand model. That's a good way to do it.
Yeah. So I think that when you're talking about chronic and critical, right? So what happens is your brain starts to respond in a way to all of the chronic stressors. And the more you use that, it's kind of like that concept of use it or lose it, right? So the more you use that, that pattern of thinking and that response pattern, the neurons that fire together wire together. And so the easier it becomes to use it. And that's what happens oftentimes when you see people's plates get full and all of a sudden, they're at their capacity, they can't handle it anymore. So a kid, the reason it happens for kids so quickly is because they get they're little, their brains are little, and so emotionally they can't handle a lot, and so they go through their whole day, and maybe they're super worn out. This is what happened for us yesterday. Is we've had a pretty busy week, and then all of a sudden it was, you have to clean your room, and that was the tipping point. Her plate was already full, and then the thought of having to clean her room was like so overwhelming, that it kind of pushed her over the edge. And so because she's so little and doesn't, she's tired, she's all this other stuff because we've been busy, all of a sudden her brain goes into a stress response. And it's like an amygdala hijack. So your brain is literally flooded with all these emotions, and she couldn't help her little self, right? So as a parent, we have to be able to step back and say, okay, how am I going to deal with this? Because what she's doing is not, she's not meaning to have this huge meltdown.
Yeah.
As adults, you got to start to recognize, and as parents too, but as adults, you got to start to recognize that in yourself early, so that you can say, okay, hang on, I'm not going to let my stress response take over right now. I've got to figure out how I'm going to calm myself back down.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways that I like to talk about this is that we call it the hand model of the brain. It's actually a concept that was put out by Dr. Dan Siegel, who I love his stuff. Any of his books, if you guys want to read them, they're great books. But it's a good way to kind of notice. So I'm going to do it really quick, and then Erica, you take over and add too, because I'm sure I'll miss something. But if you think about your brain being up here in this, kind of like sitting up there in your head, right? This front part here is your prefrontal cortex, which handles like problem solving and working memory and logic. It gives you logic. It gives you the ability to reason, right?
Yeah.
Underneath that is your amygdala, which is your fight, flight, or freeze. So this is where your stress response lives. It's the first place that it lives. So as something happens, your brain gets messages through the brainstem, and the first place it lands is your stress response, and that response is responsible for sending messages to say, hey, we're in danger, or hey, we're not. And so when your stress response thinks that you're in danger, that's when it goes, and so it kind of flips your lid is the terminology that we use. And so when I talk to kids, I tell them, so your brain goes, and it flips your lid, and you can't think anymore. Because remember, when your lid is flipped, you're all of a sudden you lose your problem solving, your ability to reason, your logic, your working memory, all of that kind of goes into haywire. And so until we can flip your lid back, that's when you can kind of restore the brain to safety, and you get to kind of experience calm again. And what happens is the more that mechanism goes into play, so the more your lid gets flipped, the easier that it does. And when people experience chronic stress or a lot of critical stress that they never work through, they live here. Yep. They live here. So any little thing is a huge reaction. So this is when you see people kind of living in the red is another phrase that we use, and they're maybe more aggressive, they're isolating more, they're using maybe not so healthy coping skills like drinking and whatever else might be, but that's because they're living here. And so we've got to find ways to keep, the reason we talk about clearing your plate and talking through chronic and critical stress is because that gives you the ability to close your lid back and not live in that super hyper vigilant state where you're always on edge.
Yeah. And the reason it happens like that is because the way the brain's evolved, this would be the spinal cord, right? And this would be the base of the brain. That's the first part of the brain that evolved, and that's what's responsible for survival. So that's breathing and metabolism and all those important things. The emotional part of the brain was next. So all mammals have, some people call this inner part the lizard brain. This part right here, the emotional brain, is the mammalian brain. All mammals have that portion of the brain, right? The newest part to evolve is this lid that flips, right? This is the human brain. And some mammals have a bit of this, but humans have it the most, right? Well, when you go into survival or fight or flight, look at that precious girl. All into this Facebook Live. When you go through a stressful situation, your brain's going to preserve resources to go to the parts of the brain that it needs to survive. It's not going to send resources up here because it only has so many. So it's going to flip that lid and turn that part off. And so that is why that happens. But here's another key piece for those of us who are parents. This is also the last part of the brain to develop, right? This part of the brain isn't developed till you're around 30, right? And so you think about why kids are very emotional and they're always reacting and not being logical, thinking through things. It's because that part of the brain has not been developed yet, right? And so the other key piece to that is this is also the part of the brain that's responsible for social interaction, right? So when we socially interact and read and reciprocate cues, it's happening in this part of the brain. Well, when that part is shot, then it's much harder to read social cues effectively. And so that's why a lot of the time it affects relationships, right? PTSD, this is not firing. They're stuck kind of like this, right? And so you think about them losing relationships and losing jobs. It's a lot of times because they can't be logical, they can't focus, they can't concentrate, do what their job requires. They also are not socially interacting appropriately and they lose marriages, right? And so that's kind of why that happens.
Yeah. So a couple of just tidbits that I would suggest that you start to do, as you know, then this is something I try to do too, is start to recognize when you feel like your lid is about to flip, right? So traffic, let's take that as an example. Anybody who's ever been in any kind of traffic can maybe, hopefully, relate to this when they feel the frustration that I do when I'm in traffic. And so that would be as I'm feeling maybe my hands grip tighter on the steering wheel or something like that, I start to tell myself, okay, you're starting to get worked up, take a deep breath, count to 10, call somebody and talk to them, whatever that might be. But starting to recognize when you're starting to feel worked up helps keep your lid closed, which helps you then problem solve and work through those moments as opposed to losing that logic or that reasoning. So talking that out, and that's a really good thing to do in front of your kids too. So if you are doing that, you're narrating those emotions. Kids don't always have the words to use. And so when you can narrate that, hey, it's normal to get frustrated. So I'll say things like, oh my gosh, I'm super frustrated right now. I need to take some deep breaths. And I literally saying those words helps model for your kids that it's okay to feel frustrated and you have ways to do and handle that and that are healthy.
Yes. Yeah, that's fantastic. Some suggestions I would have, and we call that cortical facilitation, right? Because this is the prefrontal cortex, the human brain, and you're wanting to facilitate that coming back online, closing the lid, right? And so there's a lot of different strategies out there. Breathing is a fantastic strategy, and it's a hard one to talk yourself into in the moment, but if you kind of start practicing it in smaller moments, there's a program out there called HeartMath, and they use a technique called heart-centered breathing, heart-focused breathing, and then also quick coherence, where you focus on, keep a lid on it for mental health. Yes. You focus on breathing, on a breathing strategy, and then once you get your breathing under control, you think about a particular thing in your life that brings you love or joy or gratitude, right? Because gratitude has been found in functional MRIs and love to be two of the most effective strategies for bringing that lid back down. And they can actually see that in a functional MRI. It lights up the prefrontal cortex. So if you practice that heart-focused breathing and then you think about something that brings you gratitude, love, joy, and actually try to feel that emotion, it's a very effective tool in decreasing that stress response and getting you back into the human part of your brain. I actually did this with my daughter. She's trying out for soccer right now, and she was extremely nervous about it. And so I told her, because Navy SEALs use this, snipers use this, anyone who does any kind of archery or shooting or anything like that, they know you have a process. We've talked a lot about that with Dallas Fire. You have a process for how you get centered and get into flow so that you can make the best shot, right? It's the same kind of concept. How do you get out of that reactionary part of your brain and into the focus part of your brain? So I taught this to my daughter. She thought it was very cool that professional athletes and Navy SEALs use it. And so she tried it. She said, I actually went to sleep that night and tried it. It helped me go to sleep quicker. And I said, yeah, it's a pretty effective tool. So she used it before she tried out for soccer yesterday and said it made a big difference for her in being able to just focus on being a soccer player, right? So it's something, it's teachable. It's something you can teach yourself and teach your kids, which I love.
Yeah. Yeah. And the earlier you can recognize those physical symptoms as they're happening, the earlier you can implement the strategies. Because if if you get here, it's really hard. And so sometimes it takes extra to close the lid if your lid is all the way flipped open.
Yes.
But if you can do it as, before it flips all the way open, then it's much more effective, and you can see a lot of success in helping keep yourself calm and grounded and bring yourself back. It doesn't mean, and I think that this is really important, we can't take away stress. Like, we can't take away chronic or critical stress. Things are going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it doesn't mean that, that this goes away. It just means that you have ways to cope with it that are healthy and effective and keep you, it gives you the ability to keep yourself grounded so that you can think more clearly and logically as you are having to maybe face those chronic and critical incidents.
Yeah. So if we want to switch to a resources perspective, if you want to learn more, and we can put these in the chat once we get off, but some different resources you can use. Dan Siegel has some great books. We'll put those in the chat. And there's a book by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. It's mainly geared towards trauma, not just chronic stress. But it does go a lot into the physiology of the stress response. So if that's something that you're facing quite a bit in your life, and he gives good evidence-based strategies for how to work through that. If trauma is something that you've faced or a lot of stress, fantastic book to read. And he's also got a lot of videos on YouTube. So if you're not much of a reader and you just want to learn a little more, you can just Google Bessel van der Kolk and The Body Keeps the Score. He's got a lot there. And then HeartMath that I mentioned earlier is a great biofeedback tool for understanding. It uses heart rate variability, and they are offering their entry-level course online for free right now because of COVID. So if you go to HeartMath, I can't remember if it's .org or .com, their entry-level course you can sign up for and just learn a little bit more about the physiology of the stress response and how to counter it. So those are some great resources to look at.
Yeah, I have one more book that it focuses more on the stress response side and not necessarily trauma, but it's written by an MD, so know that because sometimes it's a little academic, but it's called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And it's all about, zebras don't get ulcers because they don't lay around and stress about stuff. They wait. Their fight, flight, or freeze response is not consistently firing, kind of like we are when we worry or we have a lot of stuff on our plate. They wait until the lion comes and then respond that way. So it's a good book because it kind of talks through how chronic stress and critical stress at that can really create a lot of havoc. It's not just mental health, it's physical health, it's your sleeping, it's kind of everything that starts to get impacted when you don't start to work this stuff off your plate. So
yeah, there's a lot of talk now about, it's been there forever, but because of how logical we are, we've created a lot of chronic stress for ourselves, right? Like for zebras and horses, it's a very social stress, is a very physical stress. They look and they see something dangerous, they respond to it, they run, and then it goes away and they calm down and they just start eating grass again. But we, because we're such logical creatures, spin about it, right? And all the different other stressors that are going in, and it begins to overwhelm us. So a lot of ours is a very social and very, logistical stress that we have all the different things going on in our brain. And so we dwell a lot more than a horse or a zebra or any of that would. So yeah, that's part of our physiology that works against us sometimes,
Yeah, and a curse sometimes.
Yeah.
So next week we're going to be back and we're going to be talking more about resources and things to do. What happens when a critical incident happens, and whether that's a critical incident and you're in a high stress profession or it's, a critical incident in your personal life. And we're going to kind of be talking through what resources are out there and what can help downstream. So we've done a lot of talking about upstream and kind of getting left of boom. But life happens and things happen. And so it's good to know that there are things when a critical incident happens, there are things out there in place that are helpful that you can implement. And so we're going to be back talking about that.
Awesome.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add?
It'll be Saturday again, right? Not because we'll be teaching Dallas Fire this week as well, which we've had a phenomenal opportunity to work with them and just have some great conversations about resiliency. So, but we'll be teaching them Tuesday through Friday. So we'll be back on Saturday again next week.
Yep. So join us, and we always have our cup of coffee. So grab your cup of coffee, and we will see y'all then.
Awesome.
All right. Bye.
All right. Thanks, Kel.